Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Kathy Edwards, and for the last year, I've been serving as the chair of our Ministerial Search Committee. After a lengthy process, the committee has selected the candidate whom we enthusiastically recommend to become UUCB's lead minister, Reverend David Schwartz. To introduce him to all of you and you to him, Reverend David is participating in this candidate week, which includes the worship service we experienced this morning and next Sunday's worship service. In between, there are numerous opportunities to meet Reverend David in person or virtually. The schedule and signups can be found on the Ministerial Search page of UUCB's website. Right now, I'm delighted to host this all-church virtual question and answer opportunity with Reverend David. We will open with a brief chalice lighting, then questions in two parts. Let me explain. First, our Board of Trustees President, Chris Zanoni, will interview Reverend David, asking several foundational questions many of us may have. Second, Reverend David will answer questions from those participating in this virtual event. If you have a question for Reverend David, please enter it in the chat box at any time during this event. The questions will be relayed to Reverend David for his response after the interview with Chris. He may not get to all of them in the time we have, but there will be more opportunities this week for interactions. Let me say it again. If you have a question for Reverend David, please enter it in the chat box at any time during this event. Now I welcome Nicole Ball, a member of the search committee, who will light the chalice, reminding us of our mission.
Hello, for our chalice lighting today, we're going to revisit our mission. So as a beacon of liberal religion, we connect bravely, deepen spiritually, embody justice, and always love.
Thank you, Nicole. In that spirit, I welcome Reverend David Schwartz, the candidate your search committee recommends for UUCB's lead minister, and Chris Zanoni, our board president, who will interview him on our behalf. Chris.
Thank you, Kathy. And thanks to you and the Ministerial Search Committee for all the work you've done to bring us to this point. Good afternoon, Reverend David. Welcome to Boulder. Tom and I really enjoyed having a chance to meet you last night, along with the other board folks. So thank you for taking the time to let us get to know you better. And as has been mentioned, many opportunities over the course of the next week. So I have some questions for you. The first one is more a request, I guess. Tell us why you are a UU minister.
Thanks, Chris. And hello again, everybody. Before I answer the question, I was just remembering, in one of the two churches in Chicago I serve, the first Sunday in January every year, I lead a question box service. I don't know if you all have done these here, but the idea is that in the first part of the service, everyone puts in a question, and the sermon is just me answering questions I haven't seen before off the top of my head. And I love it. I love it. 10 years ago, that would have been terrifying to me. But these days, just like right now, it's great to be in conversation. I'm a UU minister for a lot of reasons. One of them is that I grew up as a UU. So when I was a grade schooler, I must have been about in kindergarten. My older sister, Laura, was in third grade. My parents went church shopping for a religious education program that would be a good home for their kids. My dad was raised Jewish, and he left soon after his bar mitzvah, thoroughly disillusioned with the whole thing. And my mom was raised Methodist and left at about the same age for about the same reasons. But with kids, they wanted some sort of a foundation for, moral, and I don't think they would at the time have said spiritual development, but I think that's what they were pointing to. And so we found this wonderful religious education program. And as a young kid, my questions and experiences and ideas were taken so carefully and deeply. We don't start being religious people when we turn 18. Those same experiences of awe and wonder that adults are having, little ones are too. So that was foundational to me. It taught me that part of what it is to be alive in the world and why it matters is to be engaged in the religious dimensions of human life, the spiritual dimensions. Different people have different language, so I hope you'll be generous in interpreting that if those aren't the way that you think about it. I didn't think that ministry could be a career, and I think the very first time it was mentioned to me, I was probably a junior in college by that point. And the university chaplain at Tufts, which is a historically universalist school, I didn't realize when I was studying religion and philosophy there, I was actually studying them in the same classrooms that were an old universalist seminary that had closed 50 years earlier. But the university chaplain, Scotty McLennan, was a UU minister, and we got to know each other pretty well. And he said one day, well, have you ever thought about ministry? And despite how foundational growing up UU had been, despite how important it was and is to my life, it had never crossed my mind that people become ministers. So I started looking into it, and it was a slow process. I graduated from college. Terry and I got married that summer and moved in together. And we started divinity school, both of us together, 2 weeks after getting married, which I don't recommend if you're thinking about getting married and starting grad school at like age 22. You can space that out a little bit more. And it was this gradual process of having the experience and coming to understand what ministry was, and the ways not just in which it's asking the questions that are important or big, but also a match for a lot of my skills and temperament. I love being a generalist with some specializations here and there. I love that the work is different every day. I was sharing this with the board last night. I get so energized by problems that are like big tangled balls of yarn that you have to figure out, all right, what's actually going on here? And by strategic questions that ask, what do we need to be doing now that are going to serve us best 3 to 5 years out? I didn't really know as a kid that any of those things were also what ministry is, as well as the pastoral encounter, and deep listening and preaching and all the other pieces of it. So it was this gradual process of coming to find the things in it that I loved and coming to find my own identity as a minister. No more twists and tangles in that road, but I think maybe the sermon I preached in some ways answers that question. I think that the work, one old minister said, the work of church is to become a person among persons. And I think about that a lot, that it's flourishing and creating the space for people to be able to flourish as people among people is so beautiful and gratifying to me. It's so much so that I run out of words, apparently. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Could you please describe an example of how you have fostered a caring, supportive, and inclusive fellowship?
Yeah, so I think in that question, the word that I key most into is fostered. In the way that, a gardener tends to the garden, but doesn't make the plants grow. I think that's similar in some ways to a minister, but also not just a minister, other leaders in the congregation, tending to a culture of care and hospitality, of inclusion and belonging. Thanks. Ultimately, that work is owned by the whole congregation. So I think about in Beverly Unitarian is this small congregation on the far southwest side of Chicago. They meet in a converted mansion from the 1870s. And they literally meet in the living room. Like worship is in the living room, this really small, intimate space. And, the search committee knows this story. I remember a time preaching this wonderful, warm message of welcome and belonging, the way in which we're not a club closed just for its members, the way in which we're not something to be consumed. Sunday service is a different experience than when you go watch a movie for the same length of time or something like that. But that it's a community that's co-created and survives only by giving it away to the people who are coming in through the door. And if I say so myself, it was a lovely, beautiful message that could have been like so hypocritical and absurd if people then didn't actually do that thing after the service. But I know this family with young kids was there for the first time that day. And after the service, I chatted with them for just a couple of minutes, and I knelt down to talk with, I think their oldest was about 4 then. And then, the other 5-year-olds and their parents came over, and the kids started to run off and play. And someone, seeing that this family hadn't yet made it to get food, just brought over a plate of food for them, not like pushy and not, not resentful if they didn't want it, but just, hey, would you like this? And it's that sense of hospitality, like as extroverted as I may seem in the moment, I'm an introverted person. And like so many folks, I'm intimidated walking into a new space. And so for the burden and the anxiety of welcome to be borne by the community rather than the newcomer, these are that's what it looks like when someone comes over and says, hey, do you want some of this food? Or when, the parent puts the 2 little kids together, or when the baby needs to be held by someone else for a minute. In all of those, that's the congregation caring for it. So for me, I meet with the membership team. I talk about this sort of stuff. I talk a lot about how does a newcomer who shares our values, is fed by the service, has already done their homework before coming to church, because as far as I can tell, everyone has looked at the website or like read the Unitarian Universalist Wikipedia article before they arrive. They want what they have, and the challenge isn't 99% of the time isn't could they make a home here, but can they belong? Can they cross this bridge from outsider to insider and belonging? So talking about that with membership, sending that message in classes, telling people, the highest rank that we have is member. There's not like another level above that you get to earn your way to or something. And there's not anything, I think, except voting that you can't do if you're not a member. Giving that work back to the congregation over and over again is I think, the most important thing.
Thank you. I think we can safely say that this pandemic has been difficult for all of us. How has your education or experience prepared you to help us move forward and heal from this weird year, as Reverend Jeremy had described it when he joined us?
It's such a weird year. I think, one of those things is so much of my story is, and my orientation or attitude towards life is like you make the best possible plan you can with the information and the resources that you have, and then you hold that thing really lightly. So we went out to Minnesota to be there for no more than 2 years, period, and we had a really good plan, and then things changed, and so you hold that plan lightly. We started in divinity school together, Terry and I, at the age of 22, thinking that by 25, we would be settled leading a congregation somewhere. That would have been terrible. Like, that would have been terrible for me, terrible for the congregation. I was not ready then to do that, and I feel a little bit like that coming back again. We'll plan and we'll figure things out, and then we'll hold that lightly and adjust as needed. I know also, both from my own experience and from ministry, that healing happens at its own pace. You know, you can't make a flower bloom faster by pulling the bud open. And that's true with healing too. And we're coming back together again with this incredible, I think it's fair to say this. I know this is true of the congregations there, and I would bet for y'all too. We're coming back with this strange mix of like hope and excitement to be back together again. And I think the moment in the life of this congregation of sort of being like ready for the next thing, but at the same time, we're also all exhausted. And so much of the last year and a half has been about survival. And like, that was exactly the right thing to do for the last year and a half. But we won't all like suddenly switch back again. And it may be that there's less capacity when we come back. There's less volunteer hours, there's less attention span, like, and none of those are a sign that something's gone wrong. It's that healing is going to happen at its own time. I feel like in this moment, you know, you get a new phone, say, and the battery lasts for as long as it's advertised. But then after you've had the thing for a few years, like 100% charge now gets you like 4 hours instead of 12 hours. Like, I think in a way that's part of our own situation coming back together again. And we've got to move as a community on our time as a community and have the respect and compassion that we're each coming back to this in different ways. And that, you know, say someone who's been in their house alone for the last year and a half may be so hungry for other people. And parents who have been trapped in their house with their children for the last year and a half may be so hungry for like some quiet and alone time. And it's complicated. And that there's not one solution. I think that the last thing to say on that is two of the things that really were, there's so many like obvious ahas. You know, have you had those moments where it's like, oh, this is so obvious and people have been telling it to me my whole life, but all of a sudden it makes sense. And I think back in the Target years, two of the things that really struck me was I had a boss who I just respect so much, who would always say, seek to understand before seeking to be understood, you know, which is such a cliche on the one hand, but also really true. And I feel that even if it wasn't a pandemic year, you know, that's my orientation towards ministry, that's my orientation towards coming into a new context. But especially now, to listen and to hear and to say, I don't know when I don't know. You know, I think that's a good discipline as a congregation. We're going to have to figure out the path by walking it in some sense. And that's okay. That will still be okay doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so much information about yourself. I know the link on our website has a lot of, if folks have not checked that out, please do so, but you've already given us quite a bit of information. And I'm always curious to know, what's one thing that's not already on your resume or your CV that you want us to know about you?
I think my dog shows up somewhere on the website. I have a very, very good dog. I never had dogs my whole life. This is our first dog. I am totally that stereotype of, no, I don't want a dog. Okay, I guess we're getting a dog. Fine, this will be okay. Oh my God, this is the most wonderful creature I've ever met. I love him so much. I think that's in the resume somewhere. I think the other thing for me though is, that's important to say up front, is I really like to laugh and to joke, and I don't think that there's this separation necessarily between very serious, important things and absurd things. You know, that line is so fine. And I don't mean that like in a really intense pastoral conversation or something, I'll bust out laughing. But what I mean is that's part of who I am. It's part of how I do ministry. It's part of how I do committee meetings and preaching too. There's so much silly in this world, and I don't think there's any division between silly and absurd things in a spiritual life. You know, that stuff is hand in hand. It's important to say.
Thank you.
I have a lot of dad jokes.
So dad jokes, so thanks for the warning.
Yeah, be careful. I'm sorry in advance.
Tell us about your social justice philosophy, history, how you might help us build inclusivity and dismantle white supremacy in our own.
I'm sorry, I lost you in the last part. I don't know if others could hear. Do you mind saying that again, Chris?
Not at all. So the question or the request is to tell us about your social justice philosophy, history, and how you might help us to build inclusivity and to dismantle white supremacy culture within our congregation.
So my experience is that social justice is an essential element of religious life and community, and also not the only element. So I don't mean to undercut what I'm about to say, but it's worth saying that sometimes folks come to UU churches looking only for a justice-making organization. And while that is a critically important part of what we're doing, that's not the only thing that we're doing. And in the same way, sometimes people come to our congregations looking for things that are a piece of what we are, but not all of what we are. You know, folks come in the door looking for an exclusively humanist or non-theistic way of doing religion. And while that is a big piece of who we are, that's not exclusively who we are. So it's worth saying that at the outset. I also think that in the social justice work, I tend to think of four overlapping or interlocking components, one of which is about direct service. So, you know, that's everything from providing sanctuary space, to serving meals, to raising money, you know, that goes the Give Away the Basket program. So there's a direct service component. There's an education component too. So getting ourselves to understand what is going on in this world around us. The Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, talks about this process of coming to consciousness, so that there's this essential first step of realizing what's actually going on in the world around us, and that the things we take for granted or the things that our eye just sort of slides over because it's so familiar, we have to come into this awareness that the way things are isn't inevitable. The way things are isn't the way that they have to be. So there's this education component. Then there's an advocacy component. So service, education, advocacy. I think advocacy is about changing the you know, the legal and social and frameworks that we move inside of. So it's not enough just to bandage the wounded who are walking by. You know, we need to go up the street to figure out why so many people are walking by our front door and figure out how to stop that thing too. And then I think the last piece is also direct action. So when I think about protest, I think that each of these four things are deeply connected with each other. Education provides the motivation to do service, to do advocacy, to do direct action. Direct action provides leverage that shows power. You know, after 8 years in Chicago, political power matters. And to be able to show that that it's real is a lever for change that shouldn't ever be discarded. So each of these things interlock. Folks in the congregation are going to be drawn to one or several of those more than the others, and that's okay. folks in the congregation are going to have seasons in their life where they're more active in justice work or more active in other areas. And that's okay too. But when I think about my role in all of that, I think about what are projects and work that I can make possible and make space for. And then I think about what are the things that only I can do, uniquely by virtue of the role. So then at Beverly Unitarian, this started up just before pandemic. A member who was really active in a partner organization in the community said, hey, I want to put together monthly soup and sharing potlucks where we bring a cross-section of folks from around the community and we give them discussion prompts, questions about what race and racism look like in that community. Beverly is this multiracial community perched between an almost entirely Black community on one side and an almost entirely white and deeply conservative community on the other side. So they said, well, how do we have these conversations? And what I can do in something like that is to sit down with that leader and say, all right, here are the things to think about. Here's what's going on in the space. Here's what to think about in format and time and group size. I can bring sort of expertise around some of that group process stuff to the table. And then there are also things that I can uniquely do by virtue of the role. Preaching. I preach regularly and often on social justice. After Ferguson, after Michael Brown's killer wasn't convicted, we opened up the church in Hyde Park for an interfaith vigil and absolutely packed the place with our neighboring clergy and with folks of all different faiths. It was something that we could do because we were Unitarian Universalists. And we weren't inviting, Catholics into, into the mosque up the street where they might be uncomfortable or not go for any number of differences. We weren't inviting the good progressive white folks who nonetheless were never going to go into a service at a Black church. We could host this cross-section of the community by virtue of who we were. And it was something that no one else could do in that community at that time. So I'm incredibly proud of things like that and giving the pulpit away to those community partners in that moment. I think maybe a last thing to say there is, when I think about my philosophy of social justice, also I think about who are our community partners. So who are we accountable to, and who are we in relationship with? And that's unique in every context. Before I came to serve on the south side of Chicago, I didn't live in multiracial neighborhoods for the most part. I certainly didn't live in majority Black neighborhoods. And I had so much to learn and so many partners to talk to and to take and say, who is doing the important work here? And I think about that with Boulder too. I have very limited experience with Latinx communities. I have very limited experience with immigration and immigration rights and reform because those weren't the live issues in the community where I most recently lived. So a big part of the work is figuring that out. For me, coming to understand it, being in relationship with our partners, and going from there. I think it's rarely the right thing. Well, a better way to say this, and then this will be the last thing I say on this. I have this habit of repeatedly saying, here's the last thing I'm going to say. And then there's 4 more last things. Let me the last one. Part of my orientation towards social justice is very much pragmatic. I am not interested in performance. I'm interested in fact, changing the material conditions of people's lives and the actual conditions of the world in which we live. And for me, that's part of the measuring rod also for the partners that we're going to take. It's great to talk about it. It's important to be educated. it can be strong to feel angry, but I don't want to mistake the catharsis of conversation for actual change in the world. It may be an important precondition, but what I'm interested in is what visibly, measurably, concretely are we going to do? That really was the last thing.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer. Appreciate that. In a different vein, tell us about your experience helping congregations with building issues.
Yeah, so buildings are wonderful, beautiful, complicated places, both at First Unitarian in Hyde Park, which is where Terry and I have been serving in co-ministry these last 8 years, which is a miniature Gothic cathedral. It was the last pure stone masonry, no steel scaffolding, church in the city of Chicago. And at Beverly Unitarian, which is this 1870s mansion. I helped to lead capital campaigns. The context for both of those is different. At First Unitarian, a capital campaign to modernize the building was something they'd wanted and needed for a lot of years. They built this wonderful but weird structure at 3 different time periods, about 50 years apart from each other. And every part of the building was on a different level. I think there were measured only by steps and vertical elevation. I think there are 9 or 10 floors in that building, which is absurd. So a lot of the work in that capital and in that building too, the 1931 sanctuary had all its original windows in 1931, and the 1961 RE wing had been built the cheapest, quickest possible way that it could be built in 1961, when no one paid any attention to energy costs, apparently, at least in Chicago. So a lot of the capital campaign, implicit in what I'm saying there, is the first step for them was to figure out what are we doing and why are we doing it? And for them, it was about modernizing the building, making it more accessible, making it more environmentally responsible. At Beverly, it was a different context. They found out 2 or 3 weeks before they hired me as a minister in 2017 that the whole top 15 feet of this building, which was made to look like an Irish castle, was coming apart, both because preventative maintenance hadn't been done over time. And also, I think they used the wrong kind of mortar for the bricks. I know so much more about limestone than I thought I would know 10 years ago. And so what they needed to do was to disassemble, I mean, literally stone by stone, to disassemble the top 15 feet of the building, put a new flat roof on the flat part, and then put the whole thing back together again exactly the way that it was before. That price tag was on the order of $900,000 in a congregation of 75 whose annual budget at the time was about $180K. That is an absurdly large price tag for a congregation that size. And it was really intimidating. And the process that they went through feels more like the work ahead for this congregation here in Boulder than the First U example does. Because the first thing that Beverly had to do was to have this conversation among themselves that said, what do we want to do with this building? What is our relationship to this building? They, like you, put blood, sweat, and tears and money into that building. They gutted the whole thing in the 80s when they put in like 2,000 or 3,000 volunteer hours and putting it back together again. I mean, they were in that building. And at the same time, whole chunks of that congregation for decades had wanted to get out of it. It was a historic building. It was the symbol of the neighborhood. The manhole covers in Beverly have a little embossed picture of the castle on them. And so the first conversation was not just do we stay or do we go, but what is this building to us? And what is our relationship to it? And a lot of my work in that year, that first year, was to help them remember what they already knew, but is easy to forget in crisis, that the church isn't the building. And that the thing that's real and enduring about the place is the network of connections between the people there. And whether they chose to stay or go, if they lost sight of that's the only scenario in which they really would have gotten into trouble. After they made the decision to stay, they raised the money, and for a variety of reasons, being a neighborhood landmark and public building, we're able to unlock access to public funds in a way that churches can't, and is not replicable anywhere else, I don't think. But they came to this really beautiful place of saying, well, look, we're caretakers of this building. We didn't build it, and we're not going to be here forever. But how do we be the best caretakers of it that we can right now, in all of the ways that it fits and suits us? And that, my role in all of that, in both congregations, was to help them face honestly and wholly the situation that they were in, to help them have the conversation, whether it was precipitated by crisis or by desire for improvement, about what are we investing in this building and why. And my role through the whole process also was to help them remember what they're about and who they're about, not to get so caught up in the building that they forget that the building isn't the church. And then also, of course, some of the fundraising too. So I'm comfortable asking for money, and done it before, and I raised money from alums when I was in divinity school and preach on it from the pulpit. So I think all of that too. Part of that is also setting a tone in the fundraising side, which is that we're doing this forthrightly and directly and non-anxiously, even though money can be very anxious sometimes, and from a place of real abundance, that we have everything we need. We got to figure out what to do with that and how and when and where, but we have what we need. And that's a bright vision for the future, even in the middle of uncertainty.
Okay, thank you. My last formal question before we go to from the congregation is a simple one, maybe. When you look at UUCB, what do you see?
When I look at UUCB, what do I see? I hope you won't hold me to any of this as definitive conclusions, since this is the first Sunday. But I see a few things, and some of the things that make me most excited about the congregation is what I see is a congregation that takes your mission really seriously, which is not about being a social club, and not first and foremost about serving the needs only of the people who are already here. I see a congregation who is ready to give itself away to the new people coming through the door, which is the only way to survive as a congregation. I see a congregation who is prepared to make some of the trade-offs that come with change, prepared to accept some of the real loss that comes with it. I think about your move to 2 services a few years ago, and some folks said, well, look, when that happened, it meant that we couldn't know every single person in the whole church anymore. And that loss is real. That's not something to just sort of paper over and be like, well, that doesn't matter. That is genuine change. And they said, it's worth it. It's more important to be the congregation that we're called to be and to invite others into that than it is for me, how to say it quite right, to be comfortable in the ways that I've always been comfortable, or for there not to be change. That is a beautiful and a brave thing as a congregation. I see you as a congregation who walks the walk and doesn't just talk the talk. And I think about that a lot in the vote to become a sanctuary church a few years ago. I don't know everything that went into that, but I know that the outcome was an overwhelming majority that said, this is the right thing to do, even if it means we take a really big financial hit because we end up with renters who aren't here anymore. This is the right thing to do, even if it takes a gigantic amount of work and we need to change the building, we need to put in a shower, we need to think more carefully about safety procedures, when and how do we call law enforcement, so on, and was willing to step up and do that work. And that is beautiful and real, and it shows me that you're people who don't just, say the things, but actually do them. I think the last thing to mention, because I know there's all of these other wonderful questions coming in, is I really like making things. I like making new things. When I was at Target, the things that I loved most were strategy and new kinds of learning. How do we do this differently? What might this look like down the road? At the churches that I've served, asking those questions, who do we want to be, and then how are we going to get there, is so gratifying. And even in my hobbies, I recognize this outs me as a tremendous nerd, but I am when my kids discovered Legos, I rediscovered them, and I build for them these big things, these big, sturdy, playable, usable, not models to look at, but stuff for kids to actually get their hands on. And I see in you a congregation who's ready to build. I see how much momentum you had coming into 2018. And I see you mourning the loss, not just of Kelly, but also of the momentum that had generated during her years with you. And as difficult as that is, that's also really exciting to me, because it means that you're people who know what momentum feels like that, and are ready to look for it again. That's not every congregation.
Wow. So thank you very much. This is Kathy again. Wonderful. We are going to take a moment and give you a chance to read some of the questions that have been coming in. So what we're going to do, we're moving to the second half of this forum, or the last quarter of this forum, when Reverend David will respond to the questions you have been submitting in the chat. We've been compiling every one of them into a document, which he is reviewing now. And we will add more as you type more questions, if you have more, into the chat. We will give Reverend David the opportunity to pick a question, read it to all of us, and then respond, and then pick a new question. I will monitor the time and facilitate the process. Reverend David, have you selected an initial question from those you have so far received?
I sure have. I think some of these are going to be quick and longer. Kathy and the search committee knows that sometimes I have trouble giving very brief answers to questions. Kendall asks, what's your sign? I think I'm a Virgo. I'm an early September birthday. I don't know very much though. David asks, what ideas do you have to engage children and families more in services? Make the kids feel like they're more a part of the congregation. Two thoughts on that. One is, I think that forgive me if I'm getting the name not quite right, but the Strategic Initiatives Committee, Team, Task Force, though I've only still scratched the surface on it, it looks like they have developed a really interesting approach to family ministry. And my sense is that they just started to move towards implementation, and then pandemic came and the whole thing shut down. So I'm curious to dig more into that plan and with the benefit of, a 1.5 year distance too, say, is there anything here we need to tweak? But then I don't think that's a bad plan just because we haven't had the opportunity to really implement it yet. So that's one piece. Second is, I think in some ways, the question about making kids and families too feel like they're more a part of the congregation is a question of belonging. And the ways that I know people develop that sort of belonging is by playing together, eating together, singing together, and working together. So I think about what are the ways that we do that across generations? And what are the ways we do that really deliberately across generations? Some of that is tuning our attention to those aspects of unwelcome we may not even be conscious of. My kids now, Matthew's going to turn 10 next Sunday. Got a flight to get home in time for his birthday. And Josie's 12. I've already forgotten, maybe because the body has a short memory for pain, what having infants was like. But as a congregation, that's things like, when are our meetings? Where and when is there childcare? What works for older kids but not for younger kids? And are we conscious of that and deliberately deciding that's the sort of activity or event that we want to have? How do we connect people across generations? So at First Unitarian Chicago, also at the congregation where I did my internship, there was a Christmas card exchange where elders were paired up with grade school kids in the month of December. And each Sunday they would drop into the mailbox for each other, the sort of mailbox that was set up, a card to each other with prompts on it, about their experiences, across those generations. And I think that it culminated in, a lunch for all of those folks got together and can meet each other in person and chat. And it's not that that's the right thing to do. And it's not necessarily that that's the solution, but it's that sort of thing that creates relationship. What's the highest, John Cunnington asks, what's the highest elevation you and your family have experienced? You are watching it happen right now. It's been good. So far, so good. I think we're all still adjusting. So far, so good. But I actually think I haven't been to Colorado except for the airport until the pre-candidating weekend last month. Rebecca asks, how do you see addressing the issues related to climate change in the environment? And how do they connect to other issues? Excuse me, that's Heidi and Steve. And then related, Rebecca asks, how do you feel about climate change? How do I feel about climate change? Climate change is real and is an existential threat to human life on Earth. And I don't think, as some folks do, and I respect the opinion, that means nothing else is important, or that we should stop paying attention or working or throwing ourselves into other issues. I think that climate change is not just the solution. There is no amount of personal choice and change that will solve climate change. It will require institutional and government action globally. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be making different choices as individuals. But every so often, you hear folks of goodwill and good intent who don't necessarily see the ways in which good climate choices intersect with other systems of oppression. So for example, it's easy to say, let's not shop from Amazon and let's not shop from Walmart. Like, great, yes, of course, let's buy local and organic. Also, not everyone can afford to do that. So what are we gonna do with that? That's a dilemma, there's not necessarily a a simple solution to that sort of thing. So I think very much about climate change and its intersection. I don't know the issues here locally as well, but I think about in Chicago, the South Side, which is Black, and the North Side is mostly white. West Side is Black and Hispanic, and the East Side is Lake. So much of the toxic industries in Chicago are located on the South Sides. Toxic industries are located in the poorest neighborhoods with the greatest concentrations of people of color. You know, those two things are not accidents, that they go together. So part of all of this is like an elaborate footnote that both climate change is like an existential threat to life on Earth, but also that it's not separated from the other things that we're working on and paying attention to, which I think relates to Heidi and Steve's point as your question as well. I think in all of that too, part of my orientation is to follow the interest and energy of the community too. So this goes back to the pragmatism in work for change, in social action. I think that change comes in building coalitions and commitments. And I hope it's not unsympathetic to say there may be folks in the congregation who have issues which are the burning issues in their life, but don't get traction among the rest of the congregation, don't get a critical mass to form a committee, a task force. And it doesn't mean that those things aren't important. It doesn't mean that those things aren't worth caring about. But when I think about where to, there's a way in which I want to shape, but also follow the energy of the congregation to have the greatest concrete impact on us. Are there historical UUs I've heard about in divinity school that inspired me? Yes, so many, so much, so often. But the one guy who's been on my mind lately is Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker serves church in Boston. Theodore Parker has this lovely dual commitment both to his spiritual life and growth and to social justice. So he writes this book called The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity, where he distinguishes between those elements of the Christian tradition, which are like real and enduring, and those elements which just happen to come out the way they came out because of the culture of the day. So the permanent, you know, for him in the language of his time, it's like the 1850s, you know, he would have said that like God's love for humanity is a permanent fixture of it. And, you know, the fact that that shows up in this particular form or this particular way or idiom is just an accident of the day. To me, that's a forerunner of our principles, right? Which are these very abstracted ideas that then we have to figure out, well, okay, concretely, what does this mean? What does it call us to do? Then on the other hand, Theodore Parker, his church was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and he wrote his sermons with a gun in his desk, and he was one of the Secret Six who backed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And the thing that makes him really interesting, I mean, those are fascinating. Those are like heroic things. The thing that makes him interesting as one of our ancestors is that he is also wildly, absurdly racist. He believes in biological differences between the races. He believes that Irish people are less human than Anglo people. He believes that Black people are, you know, hopelessly, I don't even want to say, I mean, I don't want to repeat his language, it's gross. That's interesting. Like, that is an ancestor worth talking about because he's complicated in so many of the same ways that, or at least in parallel ways that we're complicated. That he's both working to overcome a system and complicit in the system at the same time. Like it's this hand motion. It's yeah, all right, that's worth digging into. 3 minutes left, goodness. will my wife and kids participate in UCB activities? I sure think so and hope so. I'm really excited for good RE for my kids. Josie's just coming into the age where a youth group really matters and makes a difference, and so I'm hopeful for that. And I'm also not signing them up for anything, so this is also a question you'll need to ask them. My expectations of my spouse and kids are really different from what those expectations might have been even a generation ago, let alone a few generations ago. So I don't think Terry is going to be working on committees, bringing cookies. Actually, I hope so sometimes, but I hope she'll come preach sometime too. She's a great preacher. Goodness, what else? So many really rich questions here. Henry and Ellen ask about speaking with previous leaders and ministers. Definitely, yes. So I've been in touch already with Kelly and talked to Howell, and there's a lot more folks on that list, and regional staff. There's a lot more folks on that list to be in touch with. I don't think that your history and your history of misconduct and healing from it over determines everything that's going to happen in your future. I also don't think that it can possibly be avoided, and the impact and the shadow that it casts over the church that we still are now. Most congregations that are out there, and not to end on sort of a more sour note, but there are a lot of congregations in which ministers in the past have not done right by their congregants and have abused their trust in all sorts of different ways. Many, many fewer are the congregations who honestly face and reckon with that reality and steer into the difficulty of what that means for who they are and who they're going to be in the future. And you have done so much more of that good work than almost any other congregation I know of. There's a lot of that history still for me to learn and understand. And there are effects of it, I'm sure, that are still alive in ways that are subtle or overt. I don't know yet. But I don't have all the answers and I don't know all the information. And I'm so incredibly grateful that there are such good colleagues and past leaders of the congregation who can help me and us figure that stuff out. I think I should stop there. Otherwise, I was born in Boston. I went to Lexington High School. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts. The Minutemen were our mascot.
So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was going to answer more questions. We're out of time. Kathy, thank you for stopping us since we're out of time.
Well, I wanted to honor our 1 hour commitment. And I am, hopefully we can spotlight, let's see, there I am. Okay. Thank you so much for answering so many questions, and clearly there were more. And I hope during the week, during some of the other events, those questions have the opportunity to be voiced again and responded to. This has given us a great chance to get to know you a bit outside the role in the worship service. Before we close, I want to invite everyone to join us at the All Church Picnic this Saturday, June 12th, from 6 to 8 at the church. And please bring your own food and seating. And voting members, be sure to attend the virtual special congregational meeting to vote on calling Reverend David 1 week from now on Sunday, the 13th at noon at the Sunday service link. Nicole Ball will now extinguish our chalice. Nicole.
As a beacon of liberal religion, we connect bravely, deepen spiritually, embody justice, and always love. And on that note, we'll extinguish our chalice.
Thank you again. Thank you,
Thanks so
Reverend
much,
David.
everyone.
Yes, we hope to see everyone again at the Candidating Week events this week. Did you have any final comment, Reverend David?
No, just to say thanks so much. This sort of, I'm mindful that this has been so one-sided. It's just been me talking for an hour, but I love these conversations, and there are so many good questions we didn't get to. So I hope we can dig in, and I'm really curious for your answers to a bunch of this stuff also.
So thank you, everyone. This concludes our Q&A session.